Hello, everybody. I wanted to make a quick video regarding the Berkin First Generations paper. Had a couple of questions that makes me think that the video might be helpful. So I want to take a look at the handout again, what I'm calling the essay prompt, and point out a few things. Again, I purposely call it an essay prompt because this is supposed to prompt you to develop your specific argument. Right? This is about your argument about these women, about the colonial period more generally. So you'll notice that there are some specifics in this prompt, but there are also some more general points because everybody gets the same prompt. In a way, everybody's starting at the same starting point, but where you end up is not necessarily going to be the same as one of your classmates. So take a look at the prompt and use it that way. You should use this prompt to develop your specific thesis, your specific argument, and then set about proving that argument. So again, just a couple of things to point out. It starts off with this opening paragraph saying what we know or don't know about the colonial period is surpassed only by what we don't know about colonial women. We know very little about women's experiences in relation to men's experiences. We also tend to know less about the colonial period than we know, say, about the 20th century. So what that means is colonial women's experiences are understudied or have been understudied historically. And so part of what we're doing is looking at them specifically to get a better sense of the overall colonial era. We are using, of course, our class concept of imagined community. So I do mention imagined community there. Think about how imagined community may help us think about these categories of women. Remember, this concept doesn't just help us think about what American means. It can be an imagined community of British colonial women in the Chesapeake, an imagined community of Protestants, imagined community of Native Americans, and various communities of Native Americans. So think about how this concept helps us think about these groups. Women's daily lives are discussed in Berkin. What she does a great job of in these chapters is dealing with these specific categories of women separately, but also thinking about how they relate to men's experiences in, say, the Chesapeake or to Native American women or to African women or what have you. Right? So there are comparisons made, even though she's dealing with one specific category of women. Berkin also does a good job of opening the chapter and with one individual and using that person as kind of a frame for women's experiences more broadly, right? So think about how she uses a kind of main character to teach us about the colonial period, to teach us about women's experiences, and how those experiences might be in some ways similar to men's, in some ways very different. So think about all of those things and how she uses certain techniques to teach us about this early history. What you're doing is using this information as your specific ammunition, right? This is your specific ammunition for your argument. You don't have to recount everything in the chapter to tell me everything about Chesapeake women or what have you, or Native women. In fact, you don't have the time or the space to do that. You have to be very focused and very narrow intentionally in this project. 3 pages is not a lot of space. And so I'll say something about that in a second. So be thinking about how the information you're including supports your argument, not necessarily her argument. You don't have to agree with her argument. You don't have to agree with anything I may have said in a lecture or what have you. It's about supporting your argument, and the prompt is pushing you to develop your specific argument. So you have to be concise. You have to be analytical. Prove your point. Don't assume I agree with you. Don't assume your reader agrees with you. Don't assume anyone agrees with you. You have to convince. You have to convince us. In terms of the overall, think about a thesis. What is your thesis? Right? In a sentence or two, you should be able to focus your argument down into a sentence or two that you intend to prove in this paper. One of the things I had you do when you wrote notes on the Berkin chapters was to try to identify her thesis in that chapter. Right? That was intentional. One, because then you would be reading to see if she proves her thesis. Secondly, I wanted you to think about a thesis statement, knowing that you would be doing it later on. Okay, so in terms of the general instructions, it says to choose 3 categories of women. You had 4 categories really to choose from. British women coming to the Chesapeake, British women coming to New England, African women, or Native women, right? think about how the various permutations, depending on which categories you choose, might develop into an argument and might help you support your argument. You have some choice in that. But in talking about three categories of women, you have to be focused. You really are only going to have the time and space to pick out a couple of key topics and themes to explore, using these women to explore those themes. You cannot talk about everything. She wrote a whole book on colonial women. You're writing a 3-page comparative paper, so you have to be very focused, and that's actually part of the exercise here. Your thesis, therefore, should be focused, specific. I intend to prove this. These women's experiences were this, this, and this, and these 3 topics come up, or these 3 themes are most important, what have you. Marriage, or childbirth, or leadership, or race was the most significant factor, right? So there are things built into the prompt to help you develop that for yourself in terms of what you see as the most important themes. I mentioned a couple of times this sort of problems of the sources. If you're looking at the readings, in my notes, I wrote problems of the sources quite often. That goes back to the larger question about what we know about colonial women, or what we have to imagine about colonial women, because we do not know that much. A lot of what we know about these women, if you notice, comes through the eyes of men. Think about a Hannah Dunstan, for instance, in New England, right, who we learn about through say a Cotton Mather's or Increase Mather's sermons, right? So we know about these women by hearing it through men's voices. Or think about the Native American chapter. Wetamo never speaks directly, right? Everything we know about her, we know from the perspective of most often her enemies. Think about what your enemies might say about you and how they might characterize you. Some of it might be true, some of it might not be, right? So quite often historians have to be detectives. Quite often we're reading between the lines to figure out what's really happening. Quite often there is one perspective and another perspective, and the truth might be somewhere in the middle. So think about this kind of problem of the sources as we study the colonial period generally, because there are far fewer sources about the colonial period than any other. And also there are far fewer sources about women. What we know might come from legal documents. It might come from other sources. So we have to be careful in terms of how we interpret those sources, how we analyze them. So I listed a number of possible themes. Again, you can't talk about everything, so I listed things like religion, or region, or race, class, gender, childbirth. There are all sorts of factors that you might see as most significant, and that Berkin makes an argument about their significance in her respective chapters. Labor roles, culture, cultural practices, and such. So again, it's up to you to narrow and decide which ones you're going to talk about, and really which ones you're not going to talk about. Your introductions and conclusions are good, valuable shortcuts, right? If you're introducing a subject, your introductory paragraph might tell me all about the Chesapeake or New England, or the colonial period generally, and you might talk about certain themes there. But then by the time you get to your thesis, I'm going to talk about this, this, and this in order to prove that these women were similar or different, or whatever it is. You're going to focus on 2 or 3 key themes at that point. So you're letting your reader know, I know all these things are significant. This paper is going to talk about this, this, and this. And then, of course, in your conclusion, you do the opposite, right? You may broaden back out to summarize an overall argument, but what specifically did you prove? Right, so think about how your introductions and conclusions can help you deal with some of the broader ideas, while the body of your essay is really much more focused on the 2 or 3 key themes and the categories of women that you're talking about. Right, so there are ways to do this in a more effective manner if you are strategic. You have to think ahead of time about what your argument is and what you intend to prove. So take a look again at the essay prompt if you haven't looked at it for a while. It's designed to be helpful in all these ways for you. Again, this paper is something we thought about over time, even as we were learning about the colonial period. I wanted you to be learning about these women specifically, even as you were learning about the period more generally. So hopefully this helps your overall knowledge of the period and women's experiences specifically. Thanks.